And now I will introduce Bess Hinson, who is Chair in Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice for Morris, Manning & Martin. Bear with me as I read her bio. So she is a senior associate in the firm's technology transaction practice and the chair of the cybersecurity and privacy practice. Her primary areas of concentration include cyber and data risk management and governance, breach preparedness and response, crisis management, and global data privacy compliance. Please welcome Bess Hinson.
All right, so I'm going to hold this to make sure that I keep it close to my mouth and everyone can hear us today. But I'm so glad that you are here. This is a wonderful group, and I'm also pleased to see many of the men in the room at a women's event, and especially at a topic focused on women in cybersecurity. Now, why is it so important that we highlight women in cybersecurity? Well, studies show that 1 in 10 cybersecurity professionals is a woman. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. And there's a lot of emphasis on women in tech, women in STEM, but really the problem, the issue of our age is cybersecurity and also privacy. And there are very few women in this field. And so it's incredibly significant that here at this table in front of you, you have 5 women who work in the cybersecurity profession. Now, I'm a cyber lawyer, so I may not technically count, but every day I speak with security professionals and other experts in this field and try and advise companies around their risks when it comes to cybersecurity, which those risks, frankly, are constantly evolving. They're very difficult to keep up with. Some of our most prestigious, well-known, largest companies in the world and that are based here in Atlanta are struggling because as soon as they correct one vulnerability, they have 10 others to address. And so it's incredibly challenging, and I see some people in the room nodding their heads because they understand that. So we have a lot of experience up here. I would like for our panelists to introduce themselves before we get started, but I want to preview for you the topics we will discuss. The first, we're going to just address some general questions about cybersecurity and how we protect our businesses. Then we're going to talk a little bit about a new European regulation which is impacting American businesses and how we approach cybersecurity. We're also going to talk about third-party oversight and vendor management. And if you think about our businesses in the US today, a lot of our business functions are outsourced, right, to third-party partners to whom we're giving data and responsibility for security. We're also going to just touch on IoT devices, Internet of Things, and then also security at home. How should we think about this, and what should we be paying attention to? So with that, I'm going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves, describe to you their current role, and also talk about sort of how they got into cybersecurity. So is everyone mic on?
I believe so. Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Donna, if you'll start.
Sure. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here. And thank you to all the brave men who came today. I know it's very intimidating. But we do need male sponsorship and mentorship. So I really appreciate your support by being here, because I don't see a lot of that. And just seeing the show that we have out here of male support really warms my heart. Back to, who I am. My name is, again, Donna Gallaher. I was most recently the Information Security Officer for Incom Financial Services. So they did the prepaid Visa, MasterCard, Discover, the things that you find at the grocery stores and CVS and Walgreens. So I supported that division and then the fraud division. And prior to that, I worked as the VP of Information Security for First Advantage. I also held high-level positions in IT IT operations and service delivery. And I worked with ABB Software, running global infrastructure operations, and before that with Wipro and with SunGard in service delivery. And how I got into information security was kind of a long answer, because I think I'm older than some of the other panelists. But I graduated in electrical engineering from Auburn. War Eagle. Come on, anyone? Oh, God, there's usually one. All right. My first job in electrical engineering was actually in nuclear power. So I was the lone girl in the nuclear power plant, and my job was to supervise, electricians with 40 years of experience. Not a good mix, but I learned a lot about redundancy and access management and things that were much more related to my later career. I got into technical sales after deciding not to be an engineer anymore. I started out in relationship sales and then got more into solution sales and more technology sales, and changed into service delivery because I wanted to be more of an advocate for customers and not just sell them something and walk away from it. I really wanted to stay involved with my customers. So when I finally got into information security and cybersecurity, it was all best practices stuff that I'd been doing for 20 years before I finally landed where I am. When you get your security certification, you're kind of knighted at that point, where you've got to now carry the torch for everyone else, make sure everyone understands what's going on, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and to promote and build teams and serve as an executive leader. So that's what I'm doing now.
Hi everyone, I'm Jody Daniels, and I'm the founder of a privacy consultancy called Red Clover Advisors. So we focus most recently very much on GDPR, the European regulation that Bess just talked about, and helping U.S. companies, really actually global companies, with their compliance, but also capable of U.S. privacy. Just no one wants to talk about that recently. So looking forward to getting back to that. And my career in privacy is an interesting mix. I started in accounting, then I moved to finance and strategy. And when I was at Cox Enterprises in the strategy group, I started a behaviorally targeted ad network at AutoTrader. So I stalked you for cars. And some people found that creepy. And I worked on the industry's privacy solution to that targeting. So if you've ever gone shopping and noticed that your shoes and your light bulbs and your travel and whatever you've been looking for keeps following you around the internet. So that's what I did for cars, and then worked on the privacy angle. And from there I created a privacy program at what's now Cox Automotive, so the parent company to Autotrader.com, Kelley Blue Book, Manheim, and a long list of other companies you've probably never heard of. And from there I went on to Bank of America and was their digital privacy expert, and think online banking, mobile app, and all their digital marketing. And then last year I left my 19-year corporate career to start my consultancy. So it's been a really great journey, and thank you for allowing me to be here.
Hi, my name is Tamika Evans, and I've been in IT for at least 20 years. However, actually my passion has always been technology. But I never seen myself move forward or elevate in my career, so I decided to take a leap of faith and go back to school. So I went to University of Maryland, University College, to pursue my master's degree in cybersecurity, which I finished last month. Woo! So even prior to even getting my degree, I realized that I've actually been in cybersecurity for such a long time without even knowing it. So because dealing with antivirus software, dealing with password resets and giving people certain roles, for their accounts and things like that. So I was like, okay, well, I've been in cybersecurity for such a long time. So actually also, I decided to restructure my resume so it can highlight some of the buzzwords, so it can reflect cybersecurity career. And also I was advised to become active on LinkedIn, where my connections and recruiters can find me there. So lo and behold, after time went on, a recruiter called The Go decided to look at my resume and see my background, and they was very interested in my background. So I ended up meeting with them, and pretty much that's how actually I got into the CDC, because they liked me and they decided to hire me for the CDC. So even though you see my title as cybersecurity consultant, what I've been dealing with cybersecurity is vulnerability management, vulnerability research and vulnerabilities, as well as assets and things like that. So I mainly make sure all the systems are in compliant with no vulnerabilities or anything like that. So that's pretty much how I got into cybersecurity, and that's the short version.
Hi, I'm Elena Vilkova, and I currently work at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta as a cybersecurity analyst. My focus is encryption, SIEM administration, and analyzing web traffic. I got into cybersecurity probably while I was still in university. Me and a group of two others decided to start a student-led service to remove viruses off of computers. We worked in the computer lab at the school and noticed that this was a common problem for students. That program, which was a free service at the time, kind of expanded, and the university liked it, and that opened opportunities for me to then get an internship and then move on with my career. So that's the short version of my story.
Well, great. So very interesting and varied paths into cyber, which I think is reflective of not that it's easy to get into cyber, but that the opportunities are abundant in this day and age, and you can certainly transition from a career that you're currently in into cyber with the right training and sort of push from mentors as well. So we're going to dig in and really talk about how it is that we secure our businesses and what some of the best practices are that are recommended currently with respect to data governance, and then also security controls and user access. I'd like for our panel to give some perspective on what they recommend to businesses that are looking to address vulnerabilities and to up their cybersecurity game.
I like to start with that. So before you do anything, they tell you as a security leader, is to do a risk assessment. So what that means is understand your business, understanding what data is important, and what you really don't care about, because you only have limited finances to support your programs. So focus on the biggest fires first and understand what those things are. And it takes a lot of just going around and meeting everybody in the business. Just look at the network. You go to HR, you go to finance, you go to marketing, you go to sales, and you ask them, what do you care about? What are you doing? And what type of data are you handling? And getting a good inventory of what data you have and what systems you have will make everything else flow much, much easier. When you get hit with a new regulation like GDPR or a new PCI version comes out and you have to do this big adjustment, you want to have your inventory and your assets figured out so you know how everything works, and then you're much easier much better able to react.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything that you just said. That was actually my answer, so I have to come up with a new one. But I think one of the other places is really where are the entry points. So think onboarding and offboarding. I see many times there's no training when it comes to onboarding, and from my litigation friends, one of the very first things that they'll tell you is if you ever find yourself in a situation with a breach or any foul play, they might ask you, well, where's your training? And if you say, don't have that, you're not going to get as far as if you said, well, I did train and I did all the right things, and you can only control so much. So we want to do everything that we possibly can. So training is really critical, especially in the onboarding. And then in the offboarding, so once someone leaves, do you wipe their computer? Do you take their computer? Do you even know what credentials that they had? Did they share their credentials with all their best friends in the group? Do we share the groups, right? So really trying to manage the access controls, I think, is also very important.
I also think that dealing with certain data that you have on your system needs to be disposed, because you may be accountable just in case there's a breach or anyone wants to go onto your computer system. They will not have what we think irrelevant data, because the adversary just might use it as something important for themselves and to pretty much use it for themselves or whatever. Also, it's good to back up your data as well. Let's just say you have a ransomware that come across. You won't care because you backed up your system and backed up the data, which means it will you will not. It's pretty much like a budget call type of deal where you will not have to pay for the ransom because of the fact that you already backed up your data. Also, software updates needs to be in place. Pretty much, if you don't update your software, you're pretty much welcoming the hackers in, saying, welcome and take my data, because because of the fact it's not hard, because you need to harden the system by updating the system and updating your system and things like that. And also use a two-factor authentication when you log onto your computer, just in case if an adversary decided to get onto your computer system. They have a more difficult time than just only a password or whatever. So that's it.
With regards to vulnerability management, I think definitely a very important component of that is patch management. I think it's very important to have your leadership in your company and management in your company be on board with a patch management plan and a patch management team that includes people from various teams, making sure that you have a timetable and you know what is your time to patch critical vulnerabilities. Are you going to get to, medium or lower severity vulnerabilities? And to have that all mapped out, I think vulnerability management is best dealt with when you have a good, solid plan that everyone is on board with.
Also, scan your systems. When scanning your systems, like for instance, if you're on your systems all the time, you really don't see nothing's wrong. But by scanning your system, you may just have some type of lost vulnerabilities or anything like that, and then you can understand the severity of the vulnerability when you scan your system, so you can act on it just in case it's critical, high, or medium, or low.
Yeah, great point. Excellent points all across the board. So what is the biggest threat in the workplace, in your opinion?
People.
It's people.
All right. And
People.
And why do you say that? Can you explain to us why it is people?
I'll start. I think people have good intentions and they're lazy. They don't change passwords. They share passwords. They don't do the update that comes onto their computer. They don't sit through the training. They don't remember anything from the training. Managers are very busy, and so when someone that was probably not good what I said you should train, but it's true. So that's also part of why you can't just assume you're going to have this one-time training. It really needs to be an ongoing communication in a manner that people will engage and understand, and you need to be reminded very often. But also from a manager standpoint, people are so busy. So when people leave, all my information might be here, but definitely people. I'm sure everyone else will share more of their views.
Yeah, if you think about a computer and you program it to not work unless you follow the steps, it won't work. It won't do it, right? But a person will want to be helpful. They can be engineered to change their behavior because they want to be helpful, or you make them feel guilty, or you scare them. So that's true across the organization, not just with your passwords, but someone calling into the finance team and saying, I need this payment now, or you're going to be in trouble for this, and then money gets wired, out. So the people factor really is the weakest link in the chain. Also, if you've programmed your systems to behave a certain way, they will continue to do that until you change them, until a person changes them. I've worked in organizations where a change went in and it broke something, but it was a person that made the change. The computer didn't change itself, or the system didn't change itself, and that's what ends up opening it up to vulnerability. So making sure, as Jody said, the training is there and recognizing your people are your weakest link, and that you have procedures to verify. I think Tomika also said about the multi-factor authentication. That's not just about passwords and calling the service desk back. It's for every critical process that you have in your organization where you have to make sure and validate that this is a legitimate request coming in. And people, are the weakest link in that chain.
Great. Well, we're going to shift to our second topic, and I want to ask the audience, how many of you in this room have heard about the European General Data Protection Regulation? Okay, so we're a well-educated group, that's for sure. Well, for those of you who are not as familiar, I'd like for our panelists to enlighten all of us really from their perspective, from the security perspective, because this regulation affects many American companies that do business or market to consumers in Europe. And it may also be that it's an American business that may not necessarily market to consumers or customers in Europe, or European residents rather, but they provide services to other businesses that do, such that data belonging to those European residents enters into their systems. And so it becomes incredibly burdensome and onerous. So I want to ask, how is GDPR affecting American companies?
You want to start with that, Jody?
Sure. So, as Bess said, they're first affecting them because I am likely now in scope, and what that means is I have to know what data I have to document and have a record of processing, which means what am I doing with the data? What is the data flow? I am required to secure that data to the industry standard appropriate to the kind of data that I have. So an email needs to be protected, potentially not as significant as a national identifier or financial information, or what they call special categories like race, ethnicity, and religion. So it's the level of appropriateness, but it's security by default and privacy by design. So I have to actually think about privacy and security and make it an actionable, complete part of my culture, and have significant documentation beyond just the data inventory. If I have, I might have to have privacy impact assessments. Think of a questionnaire. What are you doing with the data? How are you using it? How are you sharing it? Where is it going? What am I doing with it? All that be documented. I could keep going, but I'm going to stop.
So I've got to, from a security perspective, you can't really have an insurance of privacy unless you've secured that data, unless it's encrypted, unless there's organizational and technical measures put in place to make sure that that's true. One of the things that the GDPR has put into the legislation is the need for a data privacy officer who is free of any conflict of interest. It's a protected position, and they're kind of the advocate for the consumer to make sure that that all those privacy measures are there. That's something that I think CISOs are going to start looking for too, is similar protections. A lot of companies, we know it's a good practice to have somebody responsible for information security, but unless you're really a regulated industry like healthcare or financial services or utilities, maybe it's not as big a priority if you're in some other industry where, we just can have somebody part-time in charge of security. So I think that will get a lot more visibility. And then the other thing about GDPR is a lot of security programs, again, if you're not in a regulated industry, maybe you have a policy, but no one really comes and checks it out if you're actually following that. But with GDPR, there are going to be certifications coming where it's actually tested. You have to demonstrate compliance. You can't just show the policy. You have to show that you're actually following the policy in order for you to become certified or remain certified. So that stuff hasn't all been worked out yet, but those are very, very positive things for security.
So do you think that companies in America should embrace this new European law as a competitive advantage, potentially?
Okay, I'll start. Yes, I love GDPR. So I think this is a great thing for companies for so many reasons. First, it's shining the light on privacy and security. So companies that didn't think I needed to pay attention to it now are paying attention to it. That is good news for everyone who is in the cybersecurity and privacy field. Bess, you mentioned that it is a growing field. So this just continues the need for why it's going to be a growing field. But it also is a competitive advantage, I think, for two other reasons. So first, you're going to know where all your data is. That might tell you, oh, wait, there's this data over here. I didn't realize that. I can do something with that. And as long as it meets all the right definitions and requirements, then you can go and use that. That's a revenue opportunity. You also might find, wait, I have data in like 5 places. Why do I need that? And that's a cost reduction for companies. And right now, there are companies who are still stomping their feet and saying, I don't want to do this. And so the companies who embrace it and say, I am here to protect your data, I am putting a stamp on it and saying, trust me with your data, are going to be the winners, because businesses are starting to only work with companies who are, I hate to use the word GDPR compliant because there's no certification for that, but are GDPR compliant. And consumers, the end individual, are going to only want to give their data to companies that they trust. So the people who embrace it are going to win, and are going to win big.
That's right. It's certainly driving a lot of calls my way, which is always a good thing. But there are obligations within the regulation where if a business is representing it is in fact GDPR compliant, it will need to go to its business partners and third-party service providers to ensure that they are also implementing certain procedures and security that correlate to the GDPR's requirements. So it becomes an incredibly not difficult, but it creates positions within companies for people to be in charge of this process, which is good for us. So we're going to take questions in a couple of minutes. We're almost at the end of our panel discussion, and I want to move on to our next topic, which is third-party oversight and vendor management, which will speak to the point I just mentioned. How do we check out what our third-party service providers are doing with data we entrust to them?
Well, I'll start. You have to recognize that just because you've outsourced a particular service or a function to another company doesn't mean that you're not responsible for it anymore. So a lot of companies still think, I'll out of sight, out of mind. I don't have to worry about this anymore. I've got such and such taking it. But we're seeing more regulations passed where you have to do your due diligence on your third parties, and you're going to be held responsible for anything that they do. So if the HVAC vendor has a breach that gets into your network and your breach, it's still going to be, your eye is going to get blackened from that. So there are the same frameworks. There's standard questionnaires. You can go out there, standard process that you can send your auditors out to go and assess your high-risk vendors. You probably can't assess all of your vendors. But like I said before, if you know where your data is, you know which vendors have your sensitive data, to focus on them and make sure that you're asking the questions and you're asking for the evidence to make sure that they're compliant, and that you've got the SLAs and reports from those vendors to make sure they're in continuous compliance with what your requirements are.
So I would add, for new vendors, to really understand what they're doing with the data and not take the first level from the salesperson of what they're doing with the data. So, but really drill in, and also don't just believe the certifications, but really understand what are they doing with the data. And that might take multiple calls, and you might need to get other people in the organization, but just don't take it at face value, but really drill into it.
And also, if you do pick, like when you pick your vendors, it's best to do a lot of research on the vendors, because of the fact that, let's just say they don't have that much, they may not have that much insight or knowledge of what needs to be done, even dealing with SLA. However, like when I was working at a company where they had to shred paper. Well, actually, I was working at a company and they outsourced somebody shredding their paper. I mean, me personally, I would never do that. I mean, I would actually have my own shredder, because of the fact that when you give them a bunch of paper, then there's dumpster diving, you know, which is social engineering. So it's best to shred your own paper. It's best to do everything that you can do before you even think about a third-party vendor. That's just my opinion.
With regards to the healthcare industry, we're always dealing with vendors and third party, especially with regards to medical devices. And I think that vendors sometimes feel like they have control of the market, that you need this system and you need this product, and they're the ones that are providing for it, and you know, they hard-coded in the password, and you know, and they're telling you that the warranty is invalid if you try and change it, and they're not going to help you. And just don't be afraid to fight them on that, and to keep saying, you know, we're going to change our vendor if you don't value security, because this affects not just your company, it affects your customers, and it also affects the vendor in the end, because people are not going to want to buy their products. I mean, the market will drive that, I think.
I just had one more thing about vendors while we were on it. Keep in mind that not all risks are cyber risks. You want to make sure that that vendor's not going to go out of business. So you'll also want to include in your vendor oversight program, how financially stable, you know, is this vendor? And am I their biggest customer? You know, what happens if they go out of business? Do I have another vendor that can supply that same service or product? So do I have a backup plan or an alternate plan? So all of that, it's an enterprise risk. It's not always a cyber risk, but that does need to go into the thought process of how you screen your vendors.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We weren't able to get to our discussion on IoT and home security, but we have time for questions now, and there may be some questions in the audience concerning those topics. So we'll start here. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so the question is there a recommendation for a password manager?
I would definitely look into the ones that you hear about. So the ones that you pay for through McAfee, through Avast, through Norton, that there are standard formats that are interchangeable. So the database file that it goes into, can be used with other formats. But I would check it out there. I also go to Kim Commando a lot when I'm looking for a product and check on her site.
So many of my security friends really like LastPass.
I have KeyPass is what I use.
Yeah, personal use, I would recommend LastPass or KeyPass. KeyPass is, LastPass is cloud, so you can usually install like an extension on your browser, and then wherever you open Google Chrome, you could log into your LastPass and you have all your passwords. KeyPass, you can have a local file, so you could put that file on an encrypted USB, and there's usually two-factor authentication to get into your database file, which would have all your passwords.
Okay, great. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Great. So any comments on that? So the point was made that within the hospitality industry, and particularly with respect to hotels, you're obtaining a lot of personal information about your guest. And if you think about it, it's not only the reservation you're making or your financial information, but it might be your food preferences or the fact that you prefer a king bed over a queen. Would that qualify under the GDPR potentially as being personal data? So that might be a good question for the panel.
Well, we had the question before about the competitive advantage of GDPR, and you'll see a lot of companies now, you might have gotten them in your email box already. They're all updating their privacy policies to comply with GDPR because it's just going to be easier to have one privacy policy that respects everybody's privacy rather than to have one for the US and one for the EU. So you're starting to see a lot of that now, and your hotels and stuff, they're going to start making it be a lot more transparent to you of what data they are collecting on you, what profiles they've built on you, and if you have a right to object, to any automated decision making and screening and stuff that they're putting on your data. So I think we touched on that before about competitive advantage, but that was a great example of where I do believe it will be.
I'd like to make a comment. The healthcare industry is also, we've had this discussion at the hospital. We're an Atlanta-based hospital, but what if we have a patient that comes in who's actually a citizen of the EU, and then does that qualify for
vital
GDPR?
interests override everything.
So really, you might feel like your industry or your company that doesn't apply to us, but then you might get a case that now it does.
Yes, ma'am. All right, so the question is, what is NIST, NIST? How is it relevant to people in the U.S.? And how does it compare to GDPR?
Okay, so NIST is National Institute of Technology and Standards, and it's really just a best practice framework. So it gives you a whole list of best practices. They have different publications that they based on, if it's incident management, if it's program management, if it's vendor management, they have a whole list of all kinds of different NIST standards that they publish on the best way to do things. So it's kind of your Bible when it comes to it. Now, mostly the government uses it, but other US-based companies use NIST as the framework that they align their security programs to. So it's not a regulation, it's not a law, it's really just a best practice framework.
No. Do you want to take that?
FedRAMP, I would probably say, is an actual certification. If you're doing business as a government contract, then FedRAMP is the certification that you're looking for, which is based on the NIST framework and best practices.
Yeah, so I was joking earlier about this question. People always ask, is there going to be a US GDPR? So I first answer with, we can't agree on very much. I don't think there's a national privacy law coming immediately. I do think that there might be a national data breach law. Right now you have 50 different states if you have a breach that you have to contend with. So there is actually a lobbying effort. I'm trying to get a single national data breach framework. The state of California, so I should probably back up a little bit. When it comes to privacy and even security, there's a patchwork system in the United States. We have, a few federal, like there's a marketing law, right? You can opt out of your emails. There's HIPAA for healthcare. There's Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. That's the reason why you get those credit card statements in the mail that maybe you read. Maybe you're like me and you put them in the garbage. So we have this sectoral approach. GDPR is a national privacy law for all of the EU member states. Very different philosophies. It's just a very, very, very different approach. But here, we often have the state of California making a variety of privacy laws, and if you do business in the United States, unless you're the local mom and pop shop, you likely then have to comply with the state of California law. So they almost end up being sort of this de facto national law, and there is a privacy law on the ballot in California that is a little bit of like a mini GDPR with some similar rights and I don't want to go out into it, but that is what the privacy community is paying attention to as sort of the next GDPR. And it will be interesting to see what happens around the world if other countries continue to begin to elevate their privacy laws from a global economic standpoint. I think then we'd be in a different position to start having that conversation.
Yeah, I actually do want to say something else about GDPR since we're kind of on the subject. And this is just kind of my observation because I've been studying for the test, But in the European Union, GDPR is really meant to cover private or public companies. It's not really about what the government knows about you. So in the European Union, they're very protective about what private companies and for-profit companies know about you. It really doesn't apply to government institutions, nonprofit organizations, religious organizations. Where in the U.S., we're concerned about what the government knows about us, right? So it's an interesting balance of the priorities are completely swapped, and we're trying to figure out how to meet in the middle. And I don't know, Jody, if you would agree with that or not. It's
I
just in my
think the
reading.
EU is also very concerned about what the U.S. government
Well, that exactly.
about their residents.
That's where their concerns are, is once it gets to the U.S., what is the U.S. government going to know about European citizens?
And I think the other interesting thing, and it gets a little bit to, we didn't necessarily talk about sort of design and kind of IoT, but in the U.S., many of the technology companies, and we have that balance of conversation right between government and private sector, but there's often some back door into it. And there's that balance of, well, I want it for national security, and well, where do you draw the line on national security tends to be the debate. But in Europe, the view is privacy is a fundamental right, and they don't like backdoors. And so it's just a very fundamental difference, and that's part of how we got to this place.
Yeah. Thanks, Jody. Great. All right, other questions? Yes, ma'am, over here. The question is, what are your recommendations for vendors who can conduct risk assessments for smaller companies?
I believe if, to research, you have to research that company to see how long they've been doing risk assessment or dealing with any type of security data on their end to pretty much make your choice, because everyone wants to be a vendor for your company, so in my opinion, I believe that you should just research just to see and look at the stats, to do the reviews on their company and see what would fit your company.
Yeah, there's great risk assessors working for lousy companies and lousy risk assessors working for some really great companies. So you really have to do your homework, you find out the confidence that you have in the knowledge of the person who's actually doing the work, and if you can get references from other companies that they've done work for, were they happy with the product that they turned out. That's how probably I'd advise you to go.
Yeah, and this may not be applicable to all smaller companies, but if your company can afford it, or if you have just a lawyer who can engage that risk assessor on your company's behalf, you could create the attorney-client privilege relationship, which I think is important for companies when they're trying to figure out what vulnerabilities exist with respect to their security and what they're doing with personal data. All right, any other questions? Yes, sir.
So most of, when I see international businesses, a lot of them are more familiar with the ISO standards than they are with NIST, which is usually US. But NIST is much more comprehensive than ISO is. So most CISOs that I know are building in their own controls, and they're doing a hybrid. They're bringing others in. If you have a cloud business or cloud application, there's the Cloud Security Alliance has the CCM or CAKE cloud control matrix that they use, which is a series of controls you can also adopt. I've seen that, also used. I believe they are now updating the cloud control matrix. I believe NIST that they're coming out with updates for GDPR and data privacy. I haven't seen them yet. I'm waiting for those to be published, but I would anticipate that that's coming shortly.
Healthcare has a lot of standards and it is regulated. So we use HIPAA, obviously, and HITRUST, which kind of gives you, HIPAA is a little bit more broad, while HITRUST gives you a lot more specific guidelines as to what to do and maybe how to do it. It's definitely in healthcare that, pretty much governs what we do and what policies we put in place, and that's definitely where budget is then allocated to those. That's what's taken care of first. And HIMSS is a certification that hospitals can get, and that's definitely very sought after in the healthcare industry. So I think it definitely gives you a competitive advantage when.
So you're right. Healthcare is always, well, at least for the last 20 years.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that they're super on top of it because they, healthcare definitely, their focus is on more so patient safety, obviously, and the patient and taking care of the patient, being, maybe lessening wait times and things like that. It's only been recently where they realized that, wait a minute, medical data and identity theft are also, risks and importance for.
Well, their fines are so large.
Regulated industries, but not in privatized or corporate. I think America is, there's no comparison to, something that has to do with consumers and purchases, and PCI is not they're gonna be much farther ahead than healthcare or education or even finance.
I'll reframe the question and sort of the conversation that we're having here, and that is the answer is yes. For a long time, certain information has been highly regulated by certain federal laws pertaining to healthcare and the financial services industry. But what we're seeing, and I think where the question or the frustration maybe with standards goes, is it's not always been the case that our healthcare data or our financial services data has been on an app, right? That you download, or that your hospital suddenly wants you to log into a portal to review your medical records, and that's all on the internet. Right, that has not been around for 20 years or 15 years or as long as GLBA has. And so it's really trying to understand how do we secure and protect that data that is very sensitive information on new technologies that are rapidly changing, right? And so maybe we can speak to that as the panel, and also with respect to the standards that are out there where we don't have federal laws available or regulations to tell us exactly what to do with the controls or the security of the technology. We're trying to utilize these standards to have some benchmark. So let's speak to that maybe.
So I was going to add, I think, so having worked in banking and recognizing the financial regulations, and you can certainly speak to HIPAA, I think where there's an interesting missing point and where standards will be helpful is those that are not in the regulation. So there's so much health data now that's on an app. Think about your if you have a Fitbit or all these other health apps that are collecting data, but they're not regulated by HIPAA. I think so many people think health data equals regulated by HIPAA, and that's so not true. And they're just freely giving all of this sure, take my blood pressure, take my weight, take my calorie intake every day, take my heart rate, take my sleeping, and I can add it all up and I can sell it because I'm not regulated and I can do whatever I kind of want to if I hopefully told you in a privacy notice. And then you have the financial apps that might be able to circumvent the system because of how they're collecting and using the data. So where I really think the standards will be helpful is where those are not followed or regulated, that they at least followed the standards to make sure that that data is protected.
For medical devices, there aren't any, when there's a vulnerability in a medical device, there's no government regulation or law that says that the vendor has to disclose that to anyone. And the hospital is just kind of relying upon the manufacturer that they'll let them know and that they'll release a fix or help them fix that. And that's something that I know that the healthcare industry is definitely trying to advocate for the FDA and for the vendors to come up with standards, to come up with regulations with regarding to medical devices and managing those, and what do you do with older medical devices or medical devices that now have the ability to connect to the network, and when a vulnerability comes out, well, turns out everything, it's all hard-coded in and it has to be replaced. How, a hospital might not want to replace thousands and thousands and sometimes millions of dollars of medical equipment. So the government and standards definitely help and give a competitive edge. I know, for example, like Mayo Clinic, they have, they say that when we purchase a medical device from you, you're going to meet these security standards, and if you don't meet those, we're not going to purchase from you. And that has had a huge impact in the healthcare industry because they're a huge hospital system. So I think that standards are definitely help.
Great. So it was a question here. Did you have a question? Okay, so the question is, should there be a standard or a regulation for social media and how social media collects information and potentially shares it or sells it?
I think that's more suited for a internal policy on the company of whether they allow employees to use social media while they're in the company or talk about whatever is going on internally on social media. I don't know, it's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balance of company, right, private sector versus what they're doing with it. And it happens to be social media where so many people are impacted, and you had some choices that maybe could have been done differently. So then people say, well, regulation's the right answer. And if I think about some of the regulations, like with email and canned spam, we all still get a lot of email. And so the regulation is, you got to look at, is it a marketing message? Is it a factual message? And can I opt out? And that was supposed to try and prevent the bad actors. Well, bad actors still make it through, and I can just opt out. It's not I don't know how meaningful it truly is this many years later that email is now ubiquitous and we all get it. Or like the text marketing campaigns where you used to get bombarded by texts, so now it's an opt-in, and that's really because you used to have to pay for it, so it wouldn't be fair for someone to have to pay for that. But now, who pays for their text messages anymore? So I feel like the challenge is, how do you make a regulation that's going to really stand the test of time and not interfere? I think self-regulatory guidelines, there's a lot of industries that pool together. You mentioned the Cloud Security Alliance. Autonomous cars have one. Retail network, so when you go into a store and they have Wi-Fi and they're monitoring everything, the retail industry got together to come up with a set of standards. So I think there's a way to be able to have really the industry players come out and speak, because my concern would be when you get regulation, then you start losing some of the freedoms that make us great. Do I think that the companies should be doing what they're doing? No, but I'm not sure complete regulation is the right way to go.
I think regulation with regard to transparency would be a good first step. I mean, I know you download an app and you want to read the EULA, the End User License Agreement, and it's very hard to read. It's mice type is like 19 pages long. It's like no one's reading that thing. But if you have noticed some of the new privacy notices that have come out that are compliant with GDPR, they're called layered, so it gives you a high level thing, and if you want to know more information, you go click on it and it gives you a little more information, and then you want to go into the weeds, you can go all the way in the weeds if you want it. I think that's probably more likely how it's going to happen. There has to be informed consent and just making people aware. Now, a lot of people are still willing to give up the farm just to get the free, cool toy, where I don't know that they're that way in Europe, but, I'd rather pay for it and know that I'm protected, then who knows what I'm giving up by accepting, just the app the way it is.
Yeah. Okay, last question over here on the left. So the question is, what are the penalties under the GDPR when it's discovered that a company is likely non-compliant or has not secured their data? Right, because...
Right, so there are breach notification requirements where you'd have to notify that supervisory authority of whatever country that is within 72 hours, and depending on what they say, that you'd have to be notified as well. There are mitigating circumstances that they use when they're assessing what the fines are going to be. So, did you have a good analysis of where your data was? Did you have all the policies in place? Did you have training done? Did you have an independent assessment certification, done of your controls of that cloud data? And how did they find out about it? Did the consumer complain to the supervisory authority and say, my data's out there now? Or did the company report it voluntarily and say, here's what happened? So I believe it's 4% or 20 million euros is the maximum. But like I said, if there's mitigating circumstances of, that they've done, it would be, on a scale.
And just to clarify, it's 4% of global turnover.
So the revenue from all different globally, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Do we have time for one last question, or are we?
Looks like the boss is...
One quick question.
Anyway, Melissa, go up there.
So if a company does business...
Wait, Melissa, just ask your question into the microphone. You're allowed to ask.
If a company does business in Europe and the United States, are they required to be compliant with GDPR?
Yes.
Oh, what about that? Gets hacked in the U.S. Guess what? If they do business also in Europe, the major companies, then they're going to be audited and they're going to have to comply with GDPR. So if your company does business in the UK or Europe, they have to comply with GDPR. But listen.
Let's have a round of applause for the...
Yes. Thank you, ladies. Y'all were fabulous. Were they fabulous? And this is 11%. 11% of women are in cybersecurity. This is part of the 11%. I think they deserve another round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
And if you enjoyed tonight's event,
Thank you.
we hope you'll join us next Thursday.
And Diane is here.
I know. We hope you'll join us next Thursday night at the Wireless Technology Forum. It's not here. It's at Atlanta Tech Village, and it's about autonomous vehicles on the road, born to be wild. Anybody born to be wild? So, and also we meet here, the Women in Wireless, every second Thursday of the month. Women in Wireless, which you can always register at the Wireless Technology Forum, and the third Thursday is the Wireless Technology Forum. So join us for both events, and listen, the best deal is just if you pay $99, you get 20 events the whole year, both second Thursday and third Thursday for $99. It's a bargain, right? What can you get for $99? But y'all did a fabulous job. We certainly appreciate you, and we hope that you'll become sponsors of Women in Wireless. It's my job. They make me do this. And talk about next month's event. Oh my gosh, it is fabulous. Diane Esther, she is a hospitality executive forever, and she...
I got this. Okay. As a continuation of really this really important topic of GDPR and privacy and cybersecurity. Travel is a $1 trillion annual, it's the largest industry in the world. We're going to have some women joining us next month. Pam Angelici was formerly the CIO for Ritz-Carlton. We've got a lot of talent, a lot of experience, a lot of expertise, and a lot of things to talk about because we all love to travel, and we all, for our jobs, in a lot of cases, travel. But we have everything from privacy to loyalty to, working in technology and all those things. So we hope that you'll come and join us. It's going to be really exciting. It's going to be very interactive. So we hope to see you next month.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, and join us next week and next month. Thank you.